Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Fall River, Massachusetts. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. It was the spring of 1897, when the small town of Fernwood in coastal Massachusetts seemed to exhale a heavy hush. The salt-laden wind swept through the narrow lanes and reached the looming facade of the Cartwright estate, an aging wooden manor set atop a knoll overlooking fog-clad woodland. On the evening of March 12th, under a slate-gray sky, the new occupant arrived, Ms. Helen Cartwright, a young widow from Providence with pale cheeks and steady eyes, stepping from the late afternoon carriage into the estate's creeping twilight. Local county records list her as the daughter of a modest merchant in Newport. Her husband had died a year earlier of consumption. She came to Fernwood intending to reclaim the old family home of her late husband and restore it to a place of dignity and sanctuary. The manor had long sat idle. Townsfolk murmured that it once belonged to the old Aldridge lineage, who sold it in 1874, and that it had since passed through one or two indifferent caretakers. The carriage door closed behind Helen, and when she paused beneath the portico, the heavy wooden door creaked shut behind her as if sealing some long-forgotten chamber. The only light was the weak glow of the hall lamp, casting long corridors of shadow. She stood there a moment, surveying the front vestibule, the carved balustrade, the thick rugs, the faint air of neglect, and resolved to make the manor hers. From the outset, Helen found the townspeople polite but distant. She met Dr. Samuel Whitcomb, the local physician, and Mr. Jasper Fielding, clerk of the parish records, both of whom noted her composed manner and unusual calm. In one letter to a friend she wrote, "This place breathes of few comforts, yet many old memories. The manor," she wrote, "waits quietly for the pulse of its new life." But even in those early weeks, something unsettled the few who came near. Neighbors reported that once the west wing shutters remained closed, though the daylight pressed in. Shadows lingered in the vaulted windows, though the rooms were empty. A gardener, Mr. Thomas Blaine, remarked in his ledger, "March 28th, wind rises about the old house." A moan possibly from the west wing, though none present. This hushed atmosphere bore a distant echo of what had occurred in 1892 with Lizzie Borden's case in neighboring Massachusetts, where a wealthy family's household in Fall River harbored violent secrets. The memory of that case lingered in local consciousness and was sometimes invoked quietly in Fernwood's gossip. "As Miss Borden's house had drawn attention," murmured one parishioner, "so may our Cartwright home yet harbor a shadow." That earlier event became a cautionary touchpoint for local papers and private diaries alike. But Helen Cartwright's situation was different, quieter, less sensational, yet in the weeks ahead certain oddities would push the hush into cold awareness. Within the first month, Helen catalogued the property's inventory. Thick rugs stored in locked closets, an overlooked cellar door beneath the dining room floor, and ledger books of the estate's former stewards, yellowing in dust. She invited Mr. Whitcomb to inspect the property's chapel room, a narrow carpeted niche at the manor's rear. Once used for family worship, its walls lined with ledgers and a wall-mounted pressed flower display. Whitcomb noted that the chapel had no records of use for more than 10 years. The hymn book remained unopened. In his report to the parish he wrote, "A solitude unusual, though the room's design speaks of gathering and life." Helen's remarked to him, "I did not expect the silence to weigh so heavily." And the manor seemed to respond, doors closing when no wind blew, floorboards creaking though the children's rooms were locked. To the casual passerby, nothing touched the world outside the estate. Fernwood's lanes remained calm. The dawn tides came and went. The town clock struck each hour unchanged. Yet inside the Cartwright manor, Helen felt something recoil. A presence, perhaps, or a memory. She confided in her journal, "I awake before dawn, hearing a footstep where none should tread." The entry was dated April 7th. When asked of it, she dismissed the sound as her own unrest. But not all residents believed it that simple. The clerk, Mr. Fielding, recorded an odd remark from a neighbor's maidservant. "I glimpsed the sash window open last night, though I had bolted it. On April 14th, the gardener Blaine logged again. West side shutter rattled, though wind was still." These events were small, seemingly benign, yet in an estate of stillness they loomed large. Helen's resolve remained firm. She wrote to a cousin, "I shall restore this home and bring it into light." But the home seemed to resist. As spring deepened and daylight lengthened, Helen invited local labourers to clear the overgrown grounds. One young man, Samuel Reynolds, recalled seeing the gardener pause by the cellar hatch and stare in silence, then withdraw without lowering the hatch. He described the interior as black and cold like a tomb. At supper, Helen heard the dog growl beneath the stairs, though the dog was alone upstairs. On May 2nd, a maid declared she smelled a faint brimstone odour near the old chapel door. Whether genuine or fanciful, these unspecified traces of unease settled in. By early June 1897, Fernwood's tranquility began to shift in quiet ways. The parish clerk's entries show growing mentions of odd happenings near the Cartwright property. Unclaimed livestock wandering toward the estate fence, lantern lights seen flickering in the woods long after curfew, and one farmhand who claimed to hear singing soft as a breath carried on the wind. Helen herself seemed thinner and more reclusive. Her once regular walks to the post office ceased, and the shutters on the west side remained closed even on bright mornings. Constable Edwin Graves recorded that when he visited the estate for routine tax notice delivery, he found the door answered not by Helen, but by an unfamiliar woman dressed in mourning black who simply stated, "Miss Cartwright takes no callers." No one else in Fernwood recalled seeing such a woman before or after. Helen later wrote to Mr. Whitcomb, the physician, "I have hired temporary help for domestic order. The house feels restless." It was around this period that whispers from the nearby township of Fall River resurfaced about the Lizzie Borden affair, still fresh in the region's collective unease. Newspapers occasionally revived the 1892 case, discussing its moral weight and mysteries unsolved. To the Fernwood townsfolk, any mention of a solitary woman in a grand home stirred uncomfortable comparison. The Boston Evening Transcript printed an editorial noting, "Massachusetts has not yet exhaled the chill of the Borden tragedy." Helen's name, though never printed, appeared in murmured conversation under similar tones of foreboding. Mid-June brought the first tangible sign of trouble. Dr. Whitcomb's journal records a summons to the manor on June 16th. Helen complained of persistent faintness and dread. He found her seated near the cold hearth, curtains drawn despite daylight, claiming she'd heard movement beneath the floorboards. Whitcomb's note, "No sign of intrusion. Patient's nerves delicate," suggested rest and companionship. Yet he too remarked on a distinct metallic scent in the air, like iron left to rust. 2 days later, the gardener Reynolds failed to report for wages. His family told the constable he'd intended to finish clearing the orchard that very week. Search parties combed the fields, and the constable's dog led them to the stream bordering Cartwright land, where they found only the man's hat, soaked and torn at the rim. Helen insisted she'd not seen him since the prior afternoon. "He waved from the south gate," she said quietly. The statement was duly written in the county log and signed in her precise hand. By July 1st, the Cartwright estate had turned near deserted. Servants resigned, citing ill humours in the air. One maid, Clara Denning, left behind a fragment of a note later retrieved by the constable. "There is whispering near the chapel after dusk. Cannot tell if wind or voice." No one took her words seriously, but several nights later, townsfolk riding past swore to hearing what sounded like furniture, dragged across wooden floors though the windows were dark. The constable's follow-up, entered July 8, 1897, describes a second visit. Miss Cartwright appeared calm yet wan. The west wing door remained bolted. Upon request for inspection, she demurred, citing disorder. Graves recorded that he felt an oppression within the halls. When he stepped outside again, he noted that the dog, kept chained by the porch, refused to re-enter. Newspapers from Boston to Providence carried small notices about a Fernwood mystery, linking it obliquely to earlier Massachusetts scandals. A Fall River editor even wrote, "The countryside breeds its own unease. One can hardly blame superstition when old houses brood." That piece casually recalled Lizzie Borden once more, cementing the regional association between isolation, inheritance, and unseen violence. As summer deepened, the manor's appearance changed subtly, ivy climbing the facade faster than anyone remembered, the garden untended yet strangely vibrant. Locals claimed to see candlelight in the attic past midnight. Dr. Whitcomb, revisiting on July 20th, found tea. By the first week of August 1897, the Cartwright Manor had become the centre of whispered superstition throughout the coastal counties. Farmers passing along the Fernwood Road would slow their wagons when crossing the bend nearest the estate. The constable's July ledger shows that no trespassers were apprehended, yet the tone of the entries changes, shorter, terser, as if the clerk hesitated to write more. Meanwhile, Helen's correspondence dwindled to a trickle. Only one surviving letter remains in County Archive, dated August 5th, addressed to her cousin Lydia in Providence. "Do not think me withdrawn, dear one. The house requires silence. There is something here that stirs when spoken of." A few days later, the townspeople began to remark upon the strange new sound at dusk, an uneven thudding, faint but rhythmic, carrying from the orchard near the Cartwright boundary. Some said it resembled the striking of wood on stone. Others insisted it was simply the report of loose shutters. Yet several residents swore the noise ceased abruptly whenever anyone neared the gate. Constable Graves, unwilling to let rumour fester, made his third recorded visit on August 12th. He found Helen in the parlour, reading by candlelight, though the sun still lingered. Her expression was composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she set aside the book. Graves' field note describes the scene with unusual precision. Curtains drawn. One candle only. Floorboards near hearth show slight rise, perhaps moisture swelling. He asked again about the west wing, and Helen replied, "That part of the house does not belong to me." When he pressed her meaning, she said no more. Graves left after dusk and told Dr. Whitcomb later that night, "I have never known such silence. It felt as if the house were holding its breath." That week a heavy storm swept the coast. Lightning struck near the Fernwood Chapel and set part of the Cartwright orchard ablaze. By morning the fire had burned itself out, leaving scorched earth and 2 half-melted iron tools buried in ash. Whitcomb arrived to offer aid and found Helen standing barefoot on the blackened soil, murmuring what he described as half-prayer, half-reckoning. She refused to leave the property, insisting that the earth itself must cool before it can rest. The physician, fearing for her health, persuaded her only to take laudanum for sleep. Rumour now grew into conviction. The Providence Gazette published a short column titled "Echoes of the Borden Years," remarking that the region seemed still haunted by solitary women and houses of grievance. Again, the Lizzie Borden reference surfaced, casually, yet effectively enough to cement Fernwood's notoriety. For some residents, that connection explained everything. For others, it only deepened their anxiety. On August 23rd, a group of parish volunteers arrived to assist in storm cleanup. In clearing debris near the cellar hatch, they discovered the nails bent outward, as if forced from within. Beneath the loosened boards lay disturbed soil and fragments of cloth, rotted, colourless, possibly linen. Whitcomb was summoned once more. His statement, now part of the county archive, reads, "Unearthed remnants indeterminate, maybe animal. Yet odour suggests old decay." Miss Cartwright appeared neither surprised nor alarmed. That evening, Helen withdrew entirely from public view. No light was seen in the manor for 3 nights. On the 4th, the constable noted a faint glow in the west wing and the outline of a figure crossing the upper corridor. He called her name from the gate but received no answer. The following morning, a postal boy reported that the front door stood ajar, and the air inside was so still that dust hung like fog. By month's end, Dr. Whitcomb filed his final entry. Miss Cartwright's whereabouts unknown since the 26th instant, estate under observation. No trace of departure by coach or rail. The county declared her missing, presumed lost, and sealed the manor pending further inquiry. The people of Fernwood, though relieved, avoided the property thereafter. In taverns they spoke softly of the lady who had come seeking peace, but found something else waiting. As one farmer told the Gazette man, she wasn't alone in that house, not after midsummer. September of 1897 settled over Fernwood with a mournful quiet. The harvest came early that year, yet few dared work the fields near the Cartwright estate. What once had been idle gossip now turned to solemn curiosity. Parishioners at St. Aldan's whispered prayers for the troubled soul of the lady of the manor, while the constable's records dwindled to single-line entries. Cartwright estate remains under lock, no trespass. But behind those brief words, unease spread like creeping fog. On September 10th, Reverend Josiah Perrin of St. Albans wrote to the county magistrate proposing a formal inventory of the house, citing moral duty to ensure no unholy practice had occurred therein. The magistrate agreed, appointing a small inspection party, Constable Graves, Dr. Whitcomb, and the Reverend himself. They arrived 3 days later beneath a pale, overcast sky, the kind that drains all warmth from colour. The estate gate hung open, its hinges rusted from the salt air. Crows perched along the fence rails, unmoving, watching. Graves recorded the condition of the interior as disturbed but orderly. Dust lay thick upon every surface. The air carried the scent of mould and iron. Helen's personal belongings remained: trunk, letters, and a locket bearing initials H.C. Inside the locket, a miniature photograph of a man thought to be her late husband. Whitcomb remarked that the image was unusually faded, as if sunless for decades. In the dining hall they found a single chair overturned and a ledger open on the table, its final page smeared by moisture. The words barely legible: "The West Wing awakens with the wind." When the men forced open the bolted West Wing door, the smell struck first: damp earth and decay. Reverend Perrin crossed himself. The chamber beyond was narrow and panelled in dark oak, the wallpaper peeling like old skin. There they found a series of shallow pits along the floorboards, each filled with black soil. Dr. Whitcomb believed them to be remnants of a failed repair, perhaps foundation work, he suggested, but Graves's later testimony hints otherwise. The shapes were deliberate, near uniform, yet not measured by carpenter's line. Beneath one of the loose boards lay a torn scrap of muslin fabric tied with twine. Whitcomb, fearing contagion, ordered it reburied and the area resealed. Yet the Reverend insisted on prayer, intoning verses from the Book of Psalms as the wind rattled the shutters. When they emerged, Perrin's hands shook. He later told his wife that he had felt as though a host of eyes watched through the very walls. The inspection report, filed on September 16th, drew cautious conclusions. Evidence inconclusive of wrongdoing. House to remain sealed pending notice. But local rumour filled the gaps official language avoided. Children claimed to hear knocks echoing from the manor's chimney. A milkman swore he saw a figure in the upper window, hair loose, face pale as moonlight. By late September, the Boston Evening Transcript revisited the story under the headline, "Mystery at Fernwood Echoes Past Crimes." The article invoked the Lizzie Borden case once more, observing how Massachusetts remains haunted by domestic shadows that refuse to fade. It questioned whether some affliction of mind or spirit ran through solitary households of women bound by inheritance and secrecy. The comparison, though speculative, reignited public fascination. Dr. Whitcomb, increasingly weary of the attention, withdrew his cooperation with reporters. In a letter to the magistrate he wrote, "The matter is not for public sport. The woman was unwell, yes, but I sensed something in the architecture itself, an unease predating her arrival." He proposed demolishing the West Wing entirely, though funding was denied. Autumn rains began soon after, flooding the lower grounds. The cellar filled ankle-deep with water. The orchard turned to mud. Locals reported that no birds nested in the trees near the property. The Reverend's final sermon that month made veiled reference to places where memory itself resists peace. By October's first frost, the Cartwright estate stood empty, its windows boarded, its gates bound with chain. Yet on certain nights, distant travellers along the Fernwood Road claimed to see a woman in black walking the perimeter with a lantern that flickered but cast no light upon the ground. None dared follow. Winter of 1897 descended on Fernwood like a veil. The air turned sharp and dry, and the fields around the Cartwright estate froze into glassy ridges of soil. Despite the cold, curiosity about the missing woman refused to rest. By November, the magistrate approved a renewed inquiry, prompted by persistent letters from Reverend Perrin and a handful of townsfolk still troubled by the silence surrounding the manor. Constable Graves, whose health had waned since the summer, agreed to assist one final search before the year's end. On November 12th, a small party entered the property once more. Dr. Whitcomb joined reluctantly, bundled in his heavy coat, his journal tucked beneath his arm. According to his later notes, the house felt colder inside than out, as if heat itself had abandoned the place. The group began in the parlour, moving methodically from room to room. Dust hung in the air like suspended fog, no trace of forced entry, yet odd impressions on the floorboards, narrow, parallel, as though made by something dragged repeatedly along the same path. In the west wing they discovered new marks, fine scratches near the window ledge, and a faint outline upon the plaster wall resembling a human hand pressed in soot. Whitcomb, pragmatic, dismissed it as smoke residue from a candle. The Reverend, less assured, crossed himself. They descended next to the cellar, where water from autumn rains had receded into dark stains across the stone. There, half buried in the mud, lay the broken frame of a mirror, its glass missing, its backplate etched with rust. Graves's report records nothing of consequence save odor persistent and faint moaning in wind through joists. That night, the Reverend refused to sleep. In a private memorandum dated November 14th, he wrote, "Dreamt the lady stood at the gate asking why the soil was turned. Her hands were dark, her eyes without light. He died less than 3 years later, never fully recovered from what his wife called the Fernwood fever." Through the final weeks of 1897, rumors mingled with snow. Children claimed to see prints in the frost outside the sealed house, barefoot, narrow, leading nowhere. The Boston Herald published a final article before Christmas titled "The Cartwright Enigma and Other Household Ghosts," drawing yet another connection to Lizzie Borden and the lingering stain of the 1892 murders. It suggested that Massachusetts still holds within its quiet homes the residue of darker deeds. Though speculative, the piece renewed interest briefly, before public attention turned to the coming century. By January 1898, the estate was auctioned to a retired shipwright named Elias Merrin, who purchased it at minimal cost. Merrin intended to salvage timber from the west wing, but after 3 days' labor, his workers refused to continue. One man, Harlan Dove, later testified, "We opened the inner paneling and found the scent of rot so strong it drove us outside." Mr. Merrin said nothing, only ordered the walls resealed. Within a week, Merrin fell ill with pneumonia and never returned. The property reverted to county claim by spring. Dr. Whitcomb left Fernwood that same year, settling inland near Worcester. In 1903, he published a modest monograph titled "On Certain Psychical Disturbances in Domestic Architecture," wherein he recounted several cases including a seaside manor whose architecture seemed to inhale the melancholy of its occupant. Scholars now believe this veiled reference concerned the Cartwright case. He cited parallels with another Massachusetts tragedy of the previous decade, a clear nod to Lizzie Borden, whom he described as a figure forever half in light, half in shadow. By the end of that decade, the Cartwright manor stood derelict, its timbers graying, its garden reclaimed by ivy. Travelers on the road to Fall River noted how the sea mist always seemed thicker there, as though the air itself wished to obscure the house from memory. And yet, whenever the fog parted at dawn, one could still glimpse the outline of the gables, and just for a moment, the suggestion of a figure watching from an upper window that no longer had glass. By 1901, the Cartwright Manor had become more myth than property. County records show it listed as vacant, unfit for residence, yet it drew the occasional wanderer, historian, or foolhardy youth hoping for a thrill. The estate's blackened shutters still hung in place, and the west wing boards remained untouched. On clear mornings, fishermen along the coast swore they saw faint lantern light inside the abandoned house, moving slowly from window to window. No constable ever confirmed it, but the rumor became as rooted as the ivy choking the gates. That spring, Professor Alden Cray from the Massachusetts Historical Institute arrived in Fernwood. He was a thin, methodical man with an interest in forgotten domestic tragedies. In his later essay, Notes on Local Superstition and Architecture, he wrote that the Cartwright estate exemplifies the intersection of private grief and rural folklore. Cray secured permission to examine the house under supervision of the parish clerk. His account remains one of the last formal descriptions of the manor before its collapse years later. He entered through the rear door, long since unlatched by storm and neglect. The floor sagged beneath his weight, and the air smelled faintly of salt and soot. He described the silence as so profound that one hears the pulse of one's own veins. In the parlor, he discovered Helen Cartwright's writing desk still standing. Within its drawer, preserved miraculously dry, lay several folded pages. The ink had bled in places, yet a few lines could be deciphered. The house remembers all who sleep beneath it. I have come to understand its patience. Cray's notes mentioned the cellar as impassable due to rotten water, but he did explore the west wing. There he found the wall panel previously described by Constable Graves still intact. Beneath flaking wallpaper, he noticed faint pencil marks, measurements perhaps, or tally lines. They ran unevenly from floor to ceiling. Cray counted 24 before the sequence broke off. A record of days, he wrote, or perhaps of prayers. The reverence of his tone hinted that even a man of study felt the same unease that had haunted Whitcomb and Perrin when Cray presented his findings at a small lecture in Boston later that year. He referenced the Lizzie Borden case as a comparative study in feminine solitude and social fear. He suggested that both stories revealed how isolation breeds both suspicion and myth. The audience, mostly academics, dismissed the comparison as overreaching, yet the paper drew quiet attention among spiritualists and amateur detectives. The Cartwright name returned briefly to newspapers in snippets titled "Echo of the Old Murder Years." Locals recalled that same autumn of 1901 for a strange, thunderless storm that swept the coast. Witnesses described red lightning above the bay and a low vibration felt in the soil. The next morning, a portion of the Cartwright roof had caved in. Parish clerk entries confirm heavy damage, though no fire followed. Curiously, the report also states a scent of camphor and lilies about the ruins, source unknown. For several nights after, travelers said the air along the Fernwood Road carried a woman's voice humming faintly, one of those old hymns once sung in family chapels. Reverend Perrin's successor refused to visit, saying, "Let her rest where she chose to dwell." The manor was left untouched again. By 1905, vegetation had swallowed the approach. Only the steeple of the small chapel remained visible from the road. Some county workers clearing debris found fragments of porcelain, a rusted hairpin, and a button bearing the initials HC. These were catalogued and later lost when the records office burned in 1912. Still, those who passed by swore that on fog-heavy mornings, the smell of damp earth and faint lilac drifted across the fence, much as Dr. Whitcomb had once noted when he said, "Something beneath wishes not to rest." By 1908, Fernwood had nearly forgotten the name Cartwright, though the manor itself still brooded above the bay. The road leading to the property had become a narrow, grass-choked path. Those who lived nearby called it the Widow's Way, a name used half in jest, but spoken with the sort of caution reserved for things not entirely harmless. The property had passed quietly to county ownership, yet every proposal to clear or sell it faltered. Engineers complained that the foundations shifted strangely with each season, as though the ground itself refused intrusion. That year, a visiting journalist from the Springfield Republican, one Mr. Howard Linton, came to Fernwood to write an article on abandoned estates of Massachusetts. His editor believed the public still harbored a taste for what he called the Borden kind of tale, and Linton agreed the Cartwright story would make suitable reading. Arriving in late April, he interviewed locals in the tavern and parish hall. Most offered only fragments, rumors of hymns sung at night, of drifting lights in the orchard, and of one farmer's boy who found a half-burned letter near the stream. The fragment read simply, "I hear the tapping again." On May 2nd, Linton visited the estate. He later described it in his notebook, portions of which survive in a Boston archive. The manor stood bowed, its upper windows gaping like sockets. Within there was a hush so complete that I felt watched by the dust itself. He recorded the interior faithfully, the broken stair rail, collapsed plaster, and the single chair that still faced the cold hearth. In the west wing, he noticed the same uneven boards mentioned years before. Under one, he found a tiny scrap of paper, edges rotted but ink preserved. The line he could read, "Forgive what the earth keeps." Linton left the house unsettled and took lodging in the village inn. That night, he dreamed of a woman standing at the orchard gate, her face indistinct but her voice clear, asking, "Will they open the soil again?" He awoke near dawn to find his notebook open on the windowsill, though he swore he had locked it in his case. He left Fernwood the following morning, declining to complete his story. His unfinished draft, however, was printed posthumously in 1911 after his sudden death from heart failure. The published version bore the headline, "The House That Waited." Public curiosity flared briefly. Scholars of the paranormal began to pair Helen Cartwright's mystery with the Lizzie Borden murders in essays about New England's domestic terrors. One Boston lecturer remarked that both women's homes stood as silent indictments of a century's restraint, mansions where the walls bore secrets no confession ever reached. Though the comparison revived the name, it also twisted the truth, for no one could prove that any murder had occurred at Fernwood at all. By 1910, the parish council voted to fence the property entirely. The Reverend's successor described it as a necessary mercy, and county officials declared the area unsafe. Yet travelers still paused at the crossroads to stare upward, and some claimed that even at midday the house looked rimmed with shadow. Others said the air there carried a faint vibration, as if a hymn were sung just below hearing. Late that autumn, one schoolteacher named Miss Eunice Lowell let her students pass the fence during a nature walk. She would later tell the constable she saw a pale figure in the window, hands folded, gaze steady, not frightening, only waiting. The children saw nothing, yet they walked home in uneasy silence. After that day, the Cartwright manor passed, again into oblivion, sealed, silent, unclaimed, yet never truly forgotten. The winter of 1912 brought deep snow to coastal Massachusetts, blanketing Fernwood and muting its roads to near silence. That same winter, a fire broke out at the county records office, destroying several archives, including the Cartwright estate file. Among the ashes, only fragments survived: property deeds, receipts for timber, and a partial inventory of furniture dated May 1897. The surviving clerk, a young man named Walter Henshaw, later remarked, "It was as if the flame had chosen its papers." His phrasing found its way into local newspapers, giving the mystery a renewed morbid poetry. Interest in the case stirred again that spring when a passing antiquarian, Mrs. Adeline Frost of Newburyport, claimed to have discovered Helen Cartwright's locket at a curiosity dealer's stall. The dealer, a man named Moritz Ellsworth, could not say where it had come from, only that it was found near Fernwood, turned up by plough. Inside the locket, the miniature portrait was nearly erased, the silver badly tarnished. Yet faint scratches on the back revealed what appeared to be initials E. Thaikais, the same as Elias Marin, the shipwright who died after briefly owning the property. The coincidence revived talk that perhaps Marin's illness had been more than mere pneumonia. Dr. Whitcomb, still living in Worcester, received a copy of the article through an old colleague. His diary entry for April 2nd reads, "So the relic emerges again. The woman remains unquiet." He declined to correspond with journalists, though he reportedly revisited Fernwood one final time that summer. There is no official record of his visit, but his journal notes a solitary line: "I heard the sea where there was no sea." He died 3 years later, leaving his papers to the university library, where they remain catalogued as private collection, domestic apparitions. Meanwhile, Fernwood itself continued to decay. A storm that autumn collapsed half the roof, and the once tall chimneys broke like gravestones. Travelers described the ruins as skeletal outlines against the mist, a cathedral for the forgotten. No one attempted repairs. Insurance claims were denied on grounds of abandonment. The land reverted once more to county possession. In 1914, a surveyor named Harold Pike was assigned to chart the coastline for new telegraph routes. His log mentions passing the Fernwood estate and hearing what he termed low hammering, though no workmen were present. He noted impressions in the mud near the old cellar door, narrow, barefoot tracks leading to the orchard and fading into waterlogged grass. Pike was a rational man, but his wife later told friends that for weeks after, he refused to travel alone at dusk. The war years that followed swallowed much of America's attention. Fernwood slipped back into obscurity, though the occasional sailor or itinerant preacher mentioned the house as a cautionary landmark. A Providence columnist in 1918 revisited the story under the title The Widow of the Wind. He compared the legend's persistence to that of Lizzie Borden, remarking that Massachusetts never buries its sins deep enough. It was a throwaway line, but one that kept both women's names alive in the public imagination. By the time the armistice was signed, Fernwood's lanes were all but reclaimed by weeds. The chapel roof had fallen in, and wild roses grew through the gaps where windows once stood. The last caretaker described the air as sweet and heavy, the scent of decay mixing with the sea's breath. He left after a single week, writing simply in the margin of his ledger, "The place sleeps, but not peacefully." By 1920, Fernwood existed more in rumour than in any official document. The manor had been reduced to a few skeletal beams, its chimney and west wall standing like a monument to something never quite confessed. Local boys dared each other to climb the hill and touch the remaining stones. Most turned back before reaching the gate. The older generation called it the widow's ruin, and if travellers asked directions, farmers simply said, "Best stay on the main road." That year, a young academic named Dr. Charles Kettering from Harvard's Department of Folklore began compiling an anthology on persistent New England legends. He traveled the coastal towns interviewing long-time residents, recording oral histories on wax cylinders. One of his most compelling sessions came from an elderly woman identified only as Mrs. Lydia Fairchild, who claimed to have served as Helen Cartwright's laundress in 1897. Her voice, faint but steady on the surviving recording, recounts, "She was a kind lady, soft-spoken, but she'd listen for something that weren't there," said the house breathed at night. Kettering later published excerpts from these recordings in his 1922 field report, where he drew explicit comparison to Lizzie Borden, observing how two women, born to restraint and inheritance, came to personify the darker whisper beneath New England's civility. His analysis was cautious, yet he concluded that Fernwood stands as much a psychological wound as a physical ruin. The academic tone could not disguise his fascination. In his private notebook, he sketched the outline of the manor and marked a spot labeled possible burial. That same year, a construction crew hired to extend the coastal telegraph line unearthed fragments of charred wood near the Fernwood boundary. Beneath them lay the remains of what appeared to be a small wooden chest, its hinges rusted to flakes. Inside were two objects later catalogued at the county museum, a silver button embossed with HC and a pressed flower remarkably intact despite the years. No papers or letters accompanied them, and both items soon disappeared from display under unclear circumstances. Locals began speaking again of the Fernwood ghost, though their stories softened over time. Some said she appeared only to those who spoke her name aloud near the chapel ruins. Others claimed to hear the echo of footsteps in the orchard during heavy fog. The village children turned the tale into a rhyme. "Helen walks when the tide is low. Soft as rain and white as snow count her steps but do not stay. For she'll ask what you took away." Even adults repeated it half in jest, though few liked to linger near the property after dark. By 1925, the ruins had become nearly indistinguishable from the hillside. Seagrass and thistle grew through the cracks, and only the old chapel bell, fallen but unbroken, remained visible among the weeds. On stormy nights, fishermen claimed the wind made that bell hum faintly, though no one ever found its clapper. In one of his last letters before his death in 1928, Dr. Kettering wrote to a colleague, "Every legend begins with a truth, however buried. The question is whether Fernwood's earth conceals its truth or protects it." His papers ended there. That same winter, a coastal patrol reported seeing a lantern moving along the cliff path near the old estate. When they investigated the next morning, they found only footprints in the frost, small, narrow, and ending abruptly at the edge overlooking the sea. The constable who filed the report noted simply, "No trace of trespassers, no sign of life, perhaps only the wind again." By 1930, Fernwood was spoken of less as tragedy and more as folklore. The new generation of townspeople, children of mill workers and fishermen, knew the story only in fragments. Some said Helen Cartwright had vanished into the marsh, others that she had fled to Providence under an assumed name. A few insisted she never existed at all, that the manor itself invented her. Yet county maps still bore the faded marking Cartwright property, abandoned, a stubborn ghost in ink. That year, a small team of architectural historians from the Massachusetts Preservation Society visited the ruins. Their goal was not to solve mysteries, but to catalogue remnants of 19th-century domestic design before time erased them. Among the team was Miss Eleanor Dufresne, a quiet woman known for her interest in female estate owners. Her field journal, now archived at the Society's Boston office, records what may be the final living account of the site before its disappearance. On April 11th, Dufresne wrote, "Approached from the East Trail, fog-heavy, air faintly metallic, ground uneven, waterlogged in parts, remains of foundation still visible, 2 chimneys upright, 1 partially collapsed." She described discovering fragments of colored glass and a rusted door hinge, likely from the west wing. Then a line written more hastily. "Heard movement in lower orchard, perhaps animals." The group spent 2 hours measuring and photographing the ruins before a sudden gust overturned one of their instruments. In the commotion, Dufresne noted an odd vibration in the earth beneath her feet, as though a cart passed below ground. Her companions heard nothing. Later that evening, as they reviewed their glass plate negatives at the Fernwood Inn, one image showed a faint blur in the doorway of the old chapel, vaguely human in shape, indistinct yet centered perfectly within the frame. The team dismissed it as a trick of exposure, though the photographer swore the doorway had been empty. In a brief footnote added months later, Dufresne referenced Lizzie Borden, calling both women figures swallowed by the tension between silence and accusation. She wondered aloud whether Helen Cartwright's story had merely been a cautionary echo shaped by the memory of Fall River's infamy. Her tone was skeptical, but the comparison preserved the Cartwright case within scholarly circles for another generation. By the mid-1930s, the last remnants of the manor were gone. A storm in 1934 swept the coastline, and what little structure remained slid down the bluff into the marsh below. Newspapers made passing mention of Fernwood Hill erosion, without acknowledging the legend it buried. For a while, the site became part of a coastal grazing field. Then even the fences decayed, and only the chapel bell, half sunk in soil, marked where the estate had stood. Still, fishermen reported strange acoustics near that stretch of shore. Voices carried oddly there. One could stand on the rocks and hear a whisper echo, as if from beneath the ground. Old sailors said it was the hollow left by the fallen house. Others that it was the lady calling through her old halls. In 1937, a teacher collecting local songs from schoolchildren included a verse that began, "Helen's house is under sea. The waves sing soft her melody, count to 3 and turn away, or she will ask with eyes of grey." The rhyme mirrored the earlier one from 1920, suggesting the legend endured quietly across decades. By the decade's end, Fernwood had become a mere name on the lips of elders, something half remembered, half feared. And yet on clear nights, some swore the tide still paused just below the ruined cliff as though listening. By the spring of 1940, the Fernwood coast looked different. The salt marsh had spread inland, swallowing the last hints of the orchard and turning the old road into a narrow footpath half buried in reeds. Only the chapel bell remained, half sunk and green with corrosion. The locals, more occupied with the rumblings of war in Europe than with ghosts at home, seldom spoke of the place. Yet for a few who remembered, the silence around that hill felt heavier than ever, as if the story itself refused to die. In April of that year, a regional historian named Milton Hayes visited Fernwood while researching maritime trade routes. He stayed at the inn once favored by the surveyors and noted in his travel diary, "The air smells of iron and lilac. Impossible to tell which memory belongs to the sea and which to the land." Hayes knew of the legend only distantly, but soon found himself drawn to the Cartwright name through a conversation with an elderly postmaster who claimed to have seen Helen as a child. "She'd bring her letters sealed with black wax," the man said, "and she never smiled. Not once." Hayes's curiosity deepened after he stumbled upon a mention of Helen in a long-forgotten parish ledger preserved in the rectory attic. The entry, dated 1897, listed a payment for repairs to the chapel flooring west nave. It was followed by a note in another hand, "Work incomplete." Lady Cartwright declined continuation. Beneath it, faint pencil script read, "Ground too soft." Hayes suspected the notation might explain the repeated rumors of hollow foundations. He copied the page and left the original undisturbed. That summer he returned to Boston and began drafting an article tentatively titled New England's Silent Houses. In it, he traced how tragedies became absorbed by geography until myth and soil were one. Halfway through his draft, he referenced Lizzie Borden, calling that older case the mother shadow from which all domestic hauntings in Massachusetts take their shape. Hayes proposed that the Cartwright mystery persisted precisely because it remained unsolved, unconfirmed, unprovable, a void that nourished imagination. When he returned to Fernwood in August to photograph the coastline, he found the ground newly disturbed near the chapel ruin. A storm had torn away part of the bluff, exposing what looked like timber beams and pale fragments of plaster. He described kneeling in the wet soil, tracing the outline of what might once have been a stairwell. From beneath came a faint trickling sound, as if water moved through hollow wood. He took 2 photographs before dusk and left quickly, unsettled. Weeks later, while developing the negatives, Hayes noticed something peculiar. In one image, the shot of the exposed stairwell, a faint figure appeared at the far edge of the frame, indistinct yet unmistakably human, standing where the hill met the fog. He examined the glass plate for damage and found none. On the back of the photograph he wrote, "Possibly reflection, though light conditions make that improbable." The photo was never published. His article appeared abbreviated in the Atlantic Quarterly in 1941, with a single cryptic closing line. "Some houses endure not in wood or stone, but in the persistence of those who will not be forgotten." Scholars later cited that sentence as the last literary mention of the Cartwright estate before the war years swallowed local history entirely. By the winter of 1942, coastal defenses had been erected near the Fernwood Bluffs. Military engineers leveled what remained of the ruins to lay concrete foundations for observation posts. No ceremony marked the demolition. Yet when the workers finished, several reported hearing the echo of a bell at dusk, though the original had been removed weeks earlier. The early months of 1943 brought a different kind of stillness to Fernwood. The military posts that replaced the manor stood quiet now, their watchmen withdrawn inland as the war's focus shifted overseas. Concrete bunkers lined the bluff, grey against grey sky, and no sign remained of the once towering house except the uneven ground that marked its foundations. Yet men stationed there swore the site was uneasy. Reports filed to the Corps of Engineers mention irregular vibrations after dusk and metallic resonance of unknown source. These phrases, sterile as they sounded, carried echoes of what the parish men had written almost half a century earlier. Private First Class Raymond Holt kept a diary during his 4-month rotation. In an entry dated April 9th, he wrote, "There's a bell ringing faint under the wind. I thought it was the harbor, but the others heard it too. Sergeant says it's the pipes singing. They doesn't sound like pipes." A later note reads simply, "Dreamed of a woman on the hill. Woke up to find my lantern lit." The diary survived because Holt mailed it home before being transferred to Europe. His niece donated it to a local museum decades later, reviving public curiosity about the long-buried place. By 1944, the old name returned to print. The Fall River Herald ran a short column titled "Echoes on the Fernwood Coast," recalling both Helen Cartwright and the enduring memory of Lizzie Borden, whose legend, the paper observed, remains Massachusetts's most persistent unease. The journalist drew the familiar parallel: 2 women, 2 houses both consumed by silence. He speculated that Fernwood's ground, once disturbed, may have learned the trick of answering back. Though most readers dismissed it as wartime distraction, the piece rekindled interest among regional historians. That summer, the military removed its equipment, leaving the hill deserted once again. Local fishermen reclaimed the shoreline, setting nets where the orchard had once descended to the marsh. In September, a storm struck the coast, tearing away sections of the bluff. When the waters receded, a portion of stone foundation emerged from the clay. Dark, smooth, and still mortared in place. A single iron hinge protruded from the mud, half corroded but unmistakably ornate. Children scavenging the beach brought it to their schoolteacher. Miss Lowell, by then an elderly woman, who kept it on her desk and told her pupils, "It's from the house that wouldn't stay buried." No further official excavations followed. The county, weary of superstition, declared the area environmentally unstable, but sailors continued to report strange reflections at sea, a shimmer of light at the bluff's edge, visible even on moonless nights. Some said it looked like a lantern. Others, a window briefly illuminated from within. One Coast Guard log notes tersely, observed flicker at EUR 100 HRs. No craft present. By winter's end, the tale of Helen Cartwright slipped again into memory. Yet each generation seemed to find its way back to her, through relic, rhyme, or rumor. Like the Borden story before it, Fernwood's mystery endured because it refused closure. As Professor Hayes once wrote, certain absences outlive every record. They breathe through the land itself. Today the hill is nothing more than wind and stone. But on nights when the tide retreats far enough, old fishermen claim they can still hear a bell faint under the surf and a woman's voice counting, softly, patiently, as though taking attendance of the forgotten. After the war, Fernwood's cliffs lay quiet once more. The military installations were left to rust, their entrances sealed by sand and salt. By 1947, the local council had reclassified the area as a natural reserve zone, though few people ever ventured near. The marsh had widened, swallowing the old orchard and chapel foundations. Even so, fishermen still claimed that the tide moved strangely there, pausing and surging again as though pulled by another current below. That year, a young researcher named Clara Denning, coincidentally sharing a name with the maid who once served Helen Cartwright, arrived from Providence College to study local folklore for her thesis. Her topic, Residual Hauntings and Cultural Memory in Coastal Massachusetts, included a section on the vanished estate. Denning corresponded with aging residents and combed through what little documentation had survived the fires and floods. She was the first to mention the forgotten parallel to Lizzie Borden in a purely academic sense, writing, "The enduring myth of Fernwood mirrors the Borden narrative, each shaped by isolation, domestic tension, and a public's need to assign guilt to silence." Denning visited the Fernwood site in June 1947, guided by an old farmer named Abram Lowe, who remembered the hill before the war. Her field notes described tall reeds, moving though the air was still, and ground that trembled faintly beneath her boots. Near the edge of the bluff, she discovered fragments of weathered stone engraved with partial lettering. Right che. It could have been from the Manor's gate sign, long thought lost. She kept a small piece for study, later recording that it emitted a faint salt crust, as if breathing sea mist even indoors. Her notes also recount an incident on the second evening of her stay. As dusk settled, she heard what she described as measured knocking, 3 times in succession, seeming to come from beneath the soil. Lowe insisted it was the shifting of sand after rain, yet she noted that each sound followed her own steps by a heartbeat's delay, as if echo answering echo. The event disturbed her enough that she left Fernwood the following morning. Back in Providence, she completed her paper but refused to publish the field recordings she'd taken, claiming the final reel produced a distortion that seemed to form a woman's voice. Her advisor persuaded her to donate the materials to the college archive, where they remained untouched until 1961. By then, Denning had become a reclusive lecturer, rarely speaking of her early work except to remark once, "Some stories do not want to be heard twice." That same summer, a coastal storm eroded the last standing trace of Fernwood's foundation. An aerial photograph taken by the Department of Conservation shows only marsh and dune where the estate once stood. Yet locals swore that for weeks after, a pale rectangle of lighter grass appeared exactly where the manor's footprint had been, visible only at dawn. Fading as the sun rose, old fishermen took it as a sign, saying the land itself had finally exhaled. Others believed it was Helen Cartwright's house reasserting its memory, like a watermark that refused to fade entirely. Whatever truth lingered beneath the soil, it had outlasted every record, every affidavit, every attempt to explain, and so the legend endured quietly. Helen's name whispered when the fog rolled in, her shadow folded into the salt wind of Fernwood, where silence had become its own form of remembrance. By the mid-1950s, Fernwood had vanished from most maps. The land was now officially designated Coastal Preservation Sector 9A, an uninhabited tract marked only by tides and reeds. Yet the story of Helen Cartwright lingered like a rumor between generations, slipping from household to household in the form of a whispered warning. It had become what folklore scholars call a survival narrative, a tale that refuses extinction. Children heard it from grandparents, who still remembered the echo of her name, while fishermen, ever cautious of the old bluff, swore the tides broke differently there, as if drawn toward something unseen. In 1953, a radio broadcaster named Roland Keane revived the legend for his program Mysteries of New England Nights. His script blended documented history with speculation, presenting the Cartwright affair as the second sorrow of Massachusetts, kin to the house of Lizzie Borden and her silent acts. The episode aired one fog-bound Sunday in March and drew unexpected response. Letters from listeners claiming ancestral connections, witnesses insisting their elders had heard the bell. Even one elderly woman from Fall River who wrote, "The Cartwright lady was kin to my aunt's employer. She was never wicked, only waiting." Keane admitted later that the volume of correspondence startled him. "It's as though she still wanted her story told," he said in an interview 2 years afterward. The radio program stirred renewed local attention. A small team from the Worcester Historical Review Society conducted an informal survey of the coast that summer, hoping to locate any remaining architectural debris. They found only remnants of concrete from the wartime installations and a patch of darker soil where the manor's foundations had once rested. When one volunteer probed the ground with a metal rod, it struck something hollow, then nothing more. Photographs of the site show reeds bent as if by a wind not felt elsewhere that day. The Society's published notes mention this anomaly briefly, concluding, "Ground conditions unstable. Further excavation not advisable." That same year, a retired sailor named William Pike donated a relic to the Fall River Maritime Museum, a corroded brass hinge with a faint floral pattern. He claimed he'd recovered it near the Fernwood Cliff. During the Great Storm of 47 Museum, curators tentatively identified it as late 19th century craftsmanship consistent with seaside estates of the 1890s. It bore no maker's mark, but when polished under laboratory light, the initials HC appeared faintly along its edge. The hinge remains on display even now, labeled simply Fernwood Relic, Siecheru, 1897. Visitors often remark that its metal gives off a faint warmth when touched. In 1956, a journalist revisiting the old radio broadcast wrote that Cartwright's story symbolized a state's quiet conscience. He suggested that Massachusetts clung to its female phantoms, Borden in Fall River, Cartwright in Fernwood, because both represented an unresolved intimacy with guilt and grief. "In both houses," he wrote, "silence spoke louder than crime." By the close of the decade, construction of a new coastal highway erased the last footpath leading to the Fernwood site. Engineers filled the marshland with gravel, paving over what little remained of the old orchard. But some of the men who worked those shifts said their machinery stalled inexplicably near the hill's crest, restarting only after dusk. One foreman later told a newspaper, "It felt like the ground didn't want us there, and when the final stretch of asphalt cooled, one of the workers swore he heard 3 distant knocks beneath his boots, measured, deliberate and fading, as though someone below was still waiting to be answered." The 1960s brought an age of modernity to Massachusetts, yet Fernwood remained curiously untouched by it. The new highway cut a clean line across the coastal bluffs, and travelers sped by without ever knowing what had once stood beneath their wheels. The Cartwright name had all but faded from public record, surviving only in footnotes of old parish ledgers and in the occasional curiosity of regional writers who gathered ghost stories for magazines. Still, every few years, the story would reappear like a persistent echo, never loud, but never gone. In 1962, an amateur historian named Edward Crane published a slim volume titled Vanished Houses of New England. The final chapter, titled The Widow of Fernwood, reconstructed Helen Cartwright's case from scattered county documents and surviving testimonies. Crane acknowledged the gaps in the record, but approached the subject with quiet reverence. Hers, he wrote, was a tragedy without spectacle. Its cruelty lay in its silence. In a brief paragraph, he compared the Cartwright mystery to Lizzie Borden, noting that Massachusetts breeds stories that rest uneasily between confession and myth. His inclusion of both names, separated by nearly half a century yet bound by rumor, restored Helen to public consciousness for a brief time. Crane's book inspired a short documentary for local television in 1965. The production team visited the Fernwood site, now a sloping field behind a rest stop, and filmed at dusk, capturing the low hum of the ocean wind across the grass. During editing, one cameraman reported a faint whisper on the soundtrack, 3 syllables long, repeating just before the final frame. The audio technician swore it sounded like a woman's voice saying, "I remain." The producers dismissed it as static, but the sequence aired exactly as recorded. Viewers wrote letters asking whether it had been deliberate. The station issued no comment. By 1968, developers began surveying the surrounding land for future housing. One of the junior surveyors, a man named Paul Grenier, later told a local paper that his instruments malfunctioned repeatedly when positioned over the center of the old property. "The compass needle spun," he said. "I thought it was a magnet in the soil, but when I moved 10 feet away, everything corrected itself." His remarks appeared only once, buried in a small article titled Coastal Oddities. In that same decade, folklore professors cited Fernwood as an example of environmental haunting, a place where memory imprinted itself upon the landscape. A scholar from Amherst University summarized, "The land itself remembers the pressure of history. The haunting is not spectral but atmospheric." That line was later quoted in a 1970 anthology alongside a renewed examination of Lizzie Borden, reinforcing once again how both women's names had become symbols of New England's unease with its own past. By 1972, the Fernwood Bluff was declared geologically unstable, and the area was fenced permanently. Only the sea approached freely, washing against the lower stones that once formed the estate's boundary wall. Yet fishermen passing offshore still spoke of strange sounds in the tide, soft impacts like measured knocks beneath their hulls. Old men said it was the hill sighing, the manor exhaling through earth and water. Those who knew the legend best said otherwise. "It's her," one retired sailor murmured to a reporter that year. "She's still counting." By the early 1980s, Fernwood existed only in archival references and the memories of a dwindling few. The coastal highway carried steady traffic where the orchard once stood, and a rest area cafe now occupied what had been the edge of the bluff. Travelers stopping for coffee had no notion that beneath the asphalt lay the foundations of a home whose story had unsettled generations. Only locals, the oldest of them, still remembered the name Cartwright, spoken quietly. Never after dark. In 1981, a university filmmaker named Thomas Ellery stumbled upon Edward Crane's 1962 book in a second-hand shop and became captivated by the idea of a lost mystery buried beneath a modern road. He petitioned the state archives for access to any surviving records of the estate, discovering just a handful of parish fragments and one brittle photograph of the West Wing before its collapse. That image, grainy and overexposed, revealed a single open window. Inside the frame, faint against the wall, was what some later insisted looked like the outline of a seated woman. Ellery's resulting documentary, The House That Waited, aired locally in 1983. It traced Helen Cartwright's life and disappearance, weaving together diary excerpts, Dr. Whitcomb's clinical notes, and newspaper clippings from the 1890s. He included references to Lizzie Borden, calling her case the public mirror to Cartwright's private tragedy. The narration was subdued, the imagery stark, shots of sea wind bending grass, waves striking stone and a lone bell half buried in mud. During one scene, his voiceover read, "Some houses hold breath instead of memory." Audiences found the film haunting rather than sensational. Letters poured into the station, describing inexplicable feelings of dread during the broadcast. One viewer wrote, "When the final scene showed the shoreline, I swore I heard knocking on my wall slow and steady. 3 times. Ellery dismissed such reactions as the power of suggestion. Though privately, he admitted the editing sweet lights flickered each time he reviewed that sequence. Following the documentary's success, the Fernwood site drew a brief surge of visitors. Motorists stopped along the highway shoulder to glimpse the landscape. A few even claimed to find fragments of brick among the reeds, porous, salt-bitten, yet clearly handmade. Local officials discouraged collecting artifacts, citing preservation laws, but the objects soon appeared at flea markets labeled "From the Lost Cartwright House." In 1985, A state geologist conducting soil tests for erosion control reported uncovering a layer of compacted clay containing irregular voids. His written observation: pattern suggests collapsed cellar structure. Depth exceeds expected foundation levels. The following day, a small tremor shook that section of the coast, registering faintly on instruments in Providence. No damage occurred, but the vibration prompted older residents to mutter that the hill shifted again. Despite this, development continued. In 1987, a new viewing platform was built nearby, offering tourists a scenic overlook of the Atlantic. At its base, workers set a bronze plaque summarizing the site's history, mentioning Helen Cartwright, her vanished house, and the phrase, "local legend." Yet vandals repeatedly pried the plaque loose. Each time it was replaced, it disappeared again within weeks. One highway attendant joked she won't let her name be pinned down. By decade's end, Ellery's documentary had become a cult curiosity among history enthusiasts. The final shot, fog rolling across the coast, dissolving the camera lens into whiteness, seemed to close the circle. But those who visited the overlook at dusk said that when the fog thinned, one could almost see the faint outline of a gable roof in the distance, precisely where the bluff met the sea. And if you stood very still, you might hear, beneath the highway's hum, the sound of something gently tapping from below. The 1990s brought a new generation of curiosity seekers, historians, paranormal researchers, and amateur documentarians chasing echoes of America's unfinished past. Fernwood, once erased from maps, re-entered popular memory through rumor, late-night radio, and Ellery's haunting 1983 film. College students came in small groups, parking along the shoulder of the highway to explore what they called the vanished house. They rarely stayed long. Most returned pale, claiming the place felt wrongly quiet. The reeds, they said, moved even when the air was still. In 1992, a writer for the New England Review, Marianne Holt, published an essay titled "The Ground That Breathes." She described walking the bluff at dawn, where the tide pressed against the rocks like a slow heartbeat. "There is a hollow under this soil," she wrote, "and something beneath still remembers weight." Holt drew direct parallels between Helen Cartwright's case and that of Lizzie Borden, observing that both women were devoured not by violence, but by the silence that followed it. Her essay renewed public fascination and sparked a series of radio interviews in which listeners shared inherited stories: an aunt's tale of a light moving in fog, a grandfather's memory of hearing a distant bell when the wind shifted inland. In 1995, a regional archaeological team conducted limited ground-penetrating radar studies near the Fernwood Overlook as part of a coastal stability assessment. The report, filed quietly with the Department of Conservation, noted anomalous cavities beneath the surface, approximately 6 feet deep and extending in irregular pattern. The findings were dismissed as natural sinkholes, though one technician, interviewed years later, recalled distinctly human geometry. "Straight lines," he said. "Whatever's under there was built, not eroded." Tourism followed. That same year, a small cafe opened near the highway advertising Cartwright coffee and postcards of the sea cliffs. The owner claimed to hear tapping beneath the building late at night, 3 knocks at a time, always near closing. Locals laughed, but employees quit frequently, and after 2 years the cafe shut down. The property remains vacant. Ellery, now an aging filmmaker, revisited his old footage to prepare an anniversary re-release. During restoration, he slowed one reel for clarity and noticed something unseen before. In the long coastal shot, just before the final fade to white, a faint shape crosses the screen, a figure in dark dress walking along the lower tide line. The motion is steady, deliberate, and vanishes midway through the frame. When questioned, Ellery merely said, "If it's her, she's walking home." The 1997 centennial of Helen Cartwright's disappearance passed quietly. A few historians proposed placing a commemorative marker, but no one could agree on the exact coordinates of the original foundation. The sea had long since reshaped the land. Instead, a modest article appeared in the Boston Herald, titled "A Century of Fernwood Silence." It ended with a single line echoing Whitcomb's century-old sentiment, "Something beneath wishes not to rest." By decade's end, Fernwood had settled once more into legend. Satellite imagery showed no trace of the manor, Yet pilots flying the coastal route between Providence and Boston occasionally reported a shimmer of structure beneath the fog, a flicker that disappeared as soon as they circled back. No one could photograph it. Some said it was sunlight on mist. Others insisted it was the reflection of a house that no longer existed, but refused to be forgotten. And at the overlook, if you stood still at night, you could sometimes hear not the wind nor the sea, but a single patient breath drawn from deep below, as though the land itself still remembered the woman who came home to silence. By the turn of the millennium, Fernwood existed only in whispers and coordinates. The highway that cut through the old bluff had been expanded once more, burying the last unpaved edges under layers of new asphalt. Travelers sped by without ever knowing that beneath the hum of tires lay what remained of a vanished house, and perhaps the echoes of a life unresolved. The sign that once read Fernwood Overlook had been replaced with a simple marker, Scenic Viewpoint 12A. Yet local maintenance crews still called it the Cartwright Bend. No one remembered when that nickname began. In 2001, a state maintenance engineer named Daniel Fry filed a peculiar report. While repairing a drainage pipe beneath the highway near the bluff, his team uncovered a hollow space. The cavity was small, roughly the width of a cellar corridor, and lined with brick so old it crumbled at touch. Inside lay fragments of timber, a corroded hinge, and what Fry described as a ring-shaped impression in the soil, like where something once rested. Before a full inspection could be made, the section collapsed under its own weight, filling again with earth and seawater. Fry's note ended. No recoverable material. Subsurface unstable. Recommend closure. The cavity was sealed with concrete within days, but not before one worker claimed he heard faint knocking from below. 3 short strikes. Clear as hammer on wood. That same year, a graduate student from Boston University, researching folklore transmission in small communities, interviewed residents of the nearby villages. Many were unaware of Helen Cartwright's name until prompted. Yet when asked if they had heard of the woman beneath the road, nearly all nodded. They spoke of a presence that rose with the fog and a light that moved against the wind. One fisherman remarked, "You can't dig here without hearing something tapping back. Maybe it's her, maybe it's the house reminding us we built too close." The student's thesis, Myths That Refuse Silence, The Persistence of Fernwood, concluded that the Cartwright story endured not because of evidence, but because it gave shape to the feeling every coastal town held, that history still breathes under their feet. She cited Lizzie Borden one final time as the visible half of Massachusetts' conscience, with Helen Cartwright as the invisible one, the echo in the soil. The paper, though academic in tone, carried the weight of something elegiac. Every legend, she wrote, is a conversation unfinished. By 2007, storms had reshaped the shoreline again. The bluff's edge fractured, leaving jagged shelves of stone that fell quietly into the sea. Tourists stopped coming. The Rest Stop Cafe, rebuilt after years of vacancy, closed once more after workers complained of electrical outages and soft thuds from below the floor. Maintenance crews dismissed it as settling ground, though one foreman refused to return after hearing what he swore was a woman's whisper through the vent, "Don't move the soil." Now, more than a century after her disappearance, Helen Cartwright's name surfaces only in late-night histories and whispered tours that skirt the coast. Nothing definitive was ever found, no body, no proof, not even the certainty of crime, and yet the legacy remains. Some say her story absorbed itself into the land, a caution to those who listened too closely. Others believe she became part of the sea, her presence carried in the tide's rhythmic pulse against the stone. On quiet nights, when the wind drops and the surf retreats, the old fishermen still claim they hear it, the echo of a single bell beneath the water, soft and deliberate, ringing 3 times. Then silence, the kind that doesn't end, only waits. And above it all, the Fernwood Road hums with passing cars, the living crossing the forgotten, unaware that the hill below still keeps count.